You're on with Lauren Zayu for Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, a show about what you say, how you say it, and what to do after it's said. We'll talk about communications and messaging blunders, successes, distractions, and what all of it means for you. Join me for a crash course in what you need to know in politics and issues driving the 2020 elections. Hello and welcome. My name is Lauren Zayu, and I want to welcome you to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. Today's show, we're discussing some of the ways that religion, particularly Christianity, has been used as a tool of oppression. Often, the right can use biblical language to cloud views that are ultimately rooted in white supremacy, and that can be confusing to navigate politically. Our guests today are well-versed in this topic through scholastic and life experience. We'll be speaking with three reverends today who all serve in Washington, D.C. with social justice and activism as a central part of their ministries. As someone who's witnessed their wisdom as a parishioner and friend, I am sure you are in for a treat. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, Reverends Elisa Aldape, Sally Sarratt, and Maria Swearingen. Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
It's so good to see all of you. You've heard the topic of today's show. We've been having these conversations amongst ourselves for as long as we've known each other. And so because the viewers/listeners don't know you as well as I do, I would love it, starting with Elisa, if you can give us a little bit of background about your scholarship and also your current service.
Hey, thanks for having us. Yes, not just me, for having all of us. So my name's Elisa. I was born in Texas and grew up in India. My parents were missionaries there for 14 years. I was there through all of my teen years, and I think that really influenced where I chose to go to college. For a lot of kids who grew up in Texas, they usually went to Baylor or to Mary Hardin Baylor or one of the Baptist universities there. But I chose to be a rebel and go to Samford University, which is not really rebellious at all. It's basically Baylor Light in Birmingham, Alabama. So I went there for college, having really no context for no understanding for what the South was like, or at least that part of the South. And that was a really interesting experience going to college. I assumed I would fit in well because I'd grown up in a lot of predominantly white spaces as the child of missionaries in a predominantly white denomination. So I was there for 4.5 years, kind of bounced around a little bit because I didn't know what I wanted to do. Then in 2012, I went to Atlanta to go to McAfee School of Theology, which is part of Mercer, so another small private Baptist university. So I studied there for 3 years, focusing in congregational leadership and what it means to be the church in the 21st century, going towards a post-Christendom world. It's a lot of fancy talk, meaning what does it mean to be church when people aren't really going to church in these days? And so graduated in 2015, which is an interesting time. I mean, everybody says it's an interesting time when they graduated. But so the day they did the laying on the hands for the graduates in chapel, it was the day after the riots began in Kirkwood, in St. Louis. The riots are happening. The Black Lives Matter movement is starting to really pick up force. The presidential campaign started kicking up, where people were making their announcements. This is a month before Trump makes his announcement. And Kelly Gissendenner was just executed. And right before chapel, the people who were trying to help us, build up our resumes as we were looking for church jobs, reminded us that making radical claims was not going to get us jobs. And so this was the climate in which we were starting to become leaders of faith and leaders in churches. And that was a really interesting time to start my career as a woman of color in predominantly white churches, in a time when saying that Black Lives Matters or that no human is illegal was some type of radical statement. And so I think that really changed my view of what it meant to be a pastor and a person of faith, because clearly the issue didn't go away when we remained silent. And so after November of 2016, I decided I would not be silent anymore, because one of the questions they asked me in my ordination review was I willing to die, not the quick, easy, martyrous death, but the slow and embarrassing and, job on the line type of death for what I believed. And so maybe not necessarily dying physically, but that idea of risking everything for what I believed and acting that out. And so that, I think that's a big part of my journey of of being a pastor and being a leader in this faith. Yeah.
Thank you, Elisa. I'm really glad to hear you, and I'm glad to hear that bit of your story. Reverends Sarratt and Swearingen, if y'all could take it away.
Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying that we're not messing with social distancing right now because we're married to each other. So secret tale. Yeah, there you have it. So Sally and I co-pastor a congregation here in downtown Washington, D.C., Calvary Baptist Church. We've been there pushing 4 years now. And again, Elisa, it's so interesting to hear you talking about timelines, right? And when you find yourself, where you find yourself. And so we were in a search process with this congregation before the election in 2016. And then we're having conversations with them as the election and its aftermath was unfolding, and then moved here, 2 weeks after the inauguration?
Yeah. That's in January, right?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. We talk a good bit about, and I'll try to say more about our story, or maybe let Sally say more about our story, but like to be a queer couple choosing to pastor a congregation here in DC, and having both of us grown up in the South, and also I think looking for space to get to be a bit freer, if you will, with our imagination. It was really strange to enter into life here in DC when the climate, the experience, the cloud began to hang over it, and has, these 4 years. So a lot of our questions and imaginings have been like, how do we walk with people who know that they feel called right now to resist the trajectory of what's happening, of white nationalism in America, of it not only existing, but being like the administration's platform. And so, we have congregants who work in the federal government. We have congregants who work resisting state power. We have congregants who are activists. We have, who are all asking intense questions about what does it mean to be faithful now, and what has it meant to be faithful these last years. But as far as our story, grew up in the South, closeted, religious. I'm a pastor's kid. It's a long story. It's a long journey. There's a lot of pain attached to it. And there's also a lot of love that's been birthed out of it. So that's the short version. That did pretty well. I mean, I'm realizing as I sit here and listen to all of us that we were all initially educated, at least at Baptist colleges. So Maria was at Baylor, which you referenced earlier. I went to Carson Newman College undergrad back in the day. And so it's interesting now to look back on the sliver of the universe that I understood at that moment in time. I had a more circuitous journey into ministry, went to business school and spent years working in that world for about a decade prior to going back to school to get to my master's in theological education. But to kind of drive towards your point of how the church and religious language and everything like that has affected the political process. My first year at Candler, I found myself researching the Proposition 8 debate back in California. That was in 2008. Ironically, that's the summer we met and fell in love. But I didn't have my ears perked, really. I mean, I knew of it in the air. I knew that it meant condemnation for me and my life and the love that I was finding and all of that. But I didn't realize the ways in which religious, moral, and political language were all intersecting to sort of create the oppression. And so as I dove in and researched some of that, Proposition 8 was to ban same-sex marriage in California. And when it started out, it was a ballot measure. When it started out,
it was going to get voted down by like 10 points. And then $83 million spent on the social issue in the state of California alone. And it ended up passing by 4 points. And so to look at that evolution and everything, and essentially what happened is, the religious right and other clergy and all these people got together to use moral and religious language to condemn same-sex marriage. But, the progressive voice or whatever tried to keep distance from religion and avoid using moral language and to say only a political issue and everything. And I think, diving into all of that made it like very, very clear to me that you can't just seed moral language, right? You have to use moral language. And I think, William Barber and others, but the Poor People's Campaign for sure. Then the next year I did my research on him and the Moral Mondays movement at that point in time, eventually became the Poor People's Campaign. But is that you can't just seed moral language. You have to be willing to use that. And I think so he's a good example of saying there are more moral issues besides like abortion and gay marriage, right? Like morality and religious language speaks to far more issues than just those things. So.
Thank you for that. And I think that's actually a great segue because moral language, I do think, is something that a lot of people on the left struggle with, mainly under the idea that I guess one is if we acknowledge that organized religion has caused a lot of issues historically, causes a lot of issues currently. So I think that there's a desire to keep distance from it and to assume that that the way Republicans cloak it and use it is the right way, is the accurate way. And so it's like, oh, well, we don't even want to engage because that's their thing. It's like, well, no, it's something that they're monopolizing and manipulating, not something that they have a monopoly on, I guess, if that makes sense. And so keeping that in mind, I would like to transition into our hold up period where we are talking about something that's not given enough weight or enough perspective. And so to kind of go in the reverse order, I'm going to start with Reverend Sarratt and Reverend Swearingen and then Reverend Aldape. But if I can call you Sally, go ahead and I guess let us know what you have found to be something that in this conversation like isn't given its due.
Yeah, and Lauren, I apologize for not giving you the preview on this one, but our conversation like forces me to like continue with it, is that it's not that racism and white supremacy have like infiltrated the church and that the church is pure and we have to like separate ourselves from it and get back to the goodness of it all and everything. Honestly, it's that the church, like, from the days of colonialism, was the one to create this language, to prop it up, to use religious language to support white supremacy. We moved here from Greenville, South Carolina, and Richard Furman, whom the university is named after, is the one who wrote the SBC, like the Southern Baptist Convention's like massive defense of slavery, right? Using religious language. And so to pretend that racism is just like a problem the church is dealing with now and not one that the church has created, I think that would be where I'd be like, hold up now, we got to have a different conversation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm sorry, y'all. We got to sit there for a minute because Sally came out with the big guns blazing.
I'm sorry, but yeah.
No, I fully support it. But I wanted to give space if anyone wanted to respond to that or echo or feel similarly.
We talk about this all the time. So Elisa, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, I just like fired up, like, oh my goodness, yes. So just kind of going back to what Sally was mentioning, as the daughter of an immigrant from South Texas, I feel like we lost a lot of our culture when, what it meant to be an American now was to be Protestant, evangelical, Baptist. And I say that being the biggest Baptist fangirl ever. There were a lot of parts of my culture that I feel like I missed out on. And so, growing up in predominantly white spaces, like I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of culture that I didn't really understand. And for a very long time, there was a lot of trying to conform into what it meant to be, you know, this person that could fit in at Samford, fit into my denomination, fit into what made people comfortable as a pastor. And yeah, I think colonialism, I mean, Christianity was colonized. And I've said this before, like, oh God, I'm going to forget the emperor's name who like said Christianity or God was the reason I won this war. And that is when Christianity became like the religion of the empire. And it's like, that's the minute that we came into power is the minute that we lost the true essence of what it meant to be people of faith. A follower who, or like a person who was brown and poor and said, go to the margins and that's where you find God. And so, I mean, I think it starts way further back, but then it like, and I think Sally was right. It did not creep in suddenly in 2016 when we were like, what is this? Like, no, it's been there. It's been how immigrants are treated when they come to America and say, leave all your culture and all your religion behind. It's there when, you know, we tell people that you need to work for your food and you don't deserve government assistance. It has been there from the beginning. And I think now, like, trying to understand what does it mean to be a Mexican American woman while also trying to decolonize my own faith and realizing just how far into my very bones that it has just seeped in, whether it is talking about ownership of my own body to where my resources come from when I write a sermon. White supremacy has just really seeped into our culture and our faith in the church. So Sally, that was spot on with what you said.
And Lauren, I know you had another pastor on here recently who you happen to be married to. You know, he talked a good bit about the role of Black religious imagination, Black Christian imagination in America. And so in one sense, like, if we want to accept that we don't want to act surprised anymore, right, in 2016, right, like, how did this happen? We have to go to the sources, to people who are the sources for knowledge, knowing this for 400 years, right? Right, the people who know whiteness deeply are the people we have to be choosing to be shaped by and formed by. And so, you know, the real, I think the future of any possibility for salvaging whatever Christian imagination is in America must begin by listening to and being shaped by and centering and elevating people who've had to analyze, interrogate, resist, and live as a result of this problematic marriage between Christianity and religious and white nationalism, right? We have to choose to be shaped by different sources.
Yeah.
Yes, and it is a choice. It's a choice to decide what you're shaped by. I fully agree there. Maria, did you want to give perhaps your hold up moment or something you feel like isn't given its due?
I mean, it's kind of tied to this. I worry about lots of things these days, but I worry a good bit about some of the language that can be used. And I get it. Some of it's cathartic, around kind of Donald Trump's behavior, that it's childish or it's ridiculous, and there's not enough credence to how it's authoritarian and deeply strategic and intending to be fascist, right? Like, and that around 30% of the American population has indicated in polling that they value an authoritarian leader. Ooh. And that number can really be like, I would say it's higher. And I would say that not paying attention to the ways in which white nationalism and white supremacy and that cocktail of white nationalism and patriarchy, right? That's a whole thing. How that shapes people to become to value authoritarianism, right? So if you value white supremacy and you value patriarchy and you kind of love that for your society, right? You're going to want an authoritarian leader. That's what's happening.
I know I fully see you there. And I think that's important to name, primarily because we know that, to be direct, one of the continuous battles of being a Black or brown person in America is having your authority questioned, right? So I find that to be interesting, particularly in light of our current situation, but also remembering like the sheer panic on Fox News and of the right wing of Barack Obama being an authoritarian, of being a tyrant, of being this thing to be feared. And even so much of his battle with Congress and in the media was having his authority questioned. And so to then come around, not even 4 years later, 5 years later, whatever it ends up being, and have that be the preference is indicative of white supremacy in the way that of the things that President Trump has done. Many of them are outside the scope of the authority of the president. But because we are not trained to question the authority of white men, it's allowed to take place however it does. So yeah, I fully agree, Maria, that is alarming. 30% is interesting, particularly when it's called authoritarian.
Yeah. And not to get too biblical, but like, why not? The early portions of the good book are stories about people who keep saying, I want a king.
Yeah.
And this God, this Exodus God, right? This God of liberation keeps saying back, no, you don't.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, no, you don't. Yes, we do. We want a king. We want a king. I'm telling you, no, you don't. What you want is freedom, right?
Yeah.
What you want is equality. What you want is imagination. What you want is love. You don't want a king. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So, yeah.
So it's always been there. That's the desire. That's what people are looking for. Elisa, did you have anything for us as far as what you wanted us to hold up and think about?
Yeah, I think we've kind of, hit it at different spots right now, but I think coming from, truly believing that we are Easter people, there are things that need to die in order to be resurrected into something good and holy and powerful. And I, as a person who loves Jesus in my very, soul, there is something about the power that Christianity has contained, American Christianity in particular, that there are parts of it that I think, what if it just died? What if it just died and it was reborn into something that didn't have the power that it has now? Or what would it mean if, the main religion in America is not Christianity anymore? Like, can we be okay with that? Like, can it not be a stat that's into a sermon where people just like, oh my God, and someone says, let that sink in. Like, yeah, let it sink in and let it be okay, because it puts God in a box. And I think for me as a faith leader, I think our faith needs to get checked. And the privilege that we have, the faith privilege that we have, needs to be checked. And that's a very scary thing to think, because that means some of my own power is relinquished. And, by all means, please.
Understood. I think that is powerful, because something that's interesting in my own, like, navigating the world as a Black woman, right? Something I've thought about is the weight you feel as an other, like, for your fellow man, if that makes sense, right? So when I'm a Black woman and I enter a space, whether I'm the first or the only when I'm there, I'm concerned about the Black women who come behind me and what my representation here means for opportunities that other Black women might have, for better or for worse. Like, I acknowledge that can be problematic as well. But there's something about the power of white people being an individual and not being concerned with how that manifests, right? And the reason I'm thinking about it in particular is because since this country began, we've had white presidents who profess to be Christian. That white male presidents who profess to be Christian, with the exception of one. And there's never, like, whether for good or for bad, there's never the like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have any more white male Christian presidents. In the same way, like, I remember actively after President Obama was elected, there was in the community, there was excitement, of course, and fever and all that, but also like, this is our one. They're not letting another one come in. And I think that became rapidly clear with Senator McConnell's declaration that this will be a one-term president. Granted, that did not come to fruition, but that was the decision that he'd made, and then proceeded on his campaign of obstruction from there on out. And keeping that in mind, I would my holdup, or something I think we should give more weight, is that the Senate, as a part of the fallout from President Trump's comments about the Proud Boys, tried to do a general condemnation, or take to vote a general condemnation on white supremacy this week. I believe it was October 1st. So immediately after, and it failed. It failed because there are not enough Senate Republicans willing to pronounce to the general public that they believe white supremacy is bad. And I think that should be alarming for the reasons on its face, but also because in a year like this one, I think it also speaks to the election cycle. There's an assumption that Vice President Biden has this in the bag, and that, election night will be the end of the 4-year reign of this person. And we don't know that, but also I think it says a lot that for Senate Republicans to be as allegedly precarious as they are, they still will not turn against white supremacy. I'm thinking about Lindsey Graham and the belly aching he's been doing everywhere about Jamie Harrison raising money. I'm thinking about Mitch McConnell and his challenger, Amy McGrath. I'm thinking about MJ Hager down in Texas, all of whom are in places that are normally solidly red, putting up a fight. And even in the midst of all of that, I think because of the midst of all of that, there is this clinging to white supremacy that is happening as what the Republican Party has decided to circle their bandwagons with. Like, this is what we're going to stake our claim on. And that's something that I think didn't get enough weight. So keeping that in mind, I want to shift into I Ain't Sorry, right? Which is where we give what we're unapologetic about, and mixing it up a little bit. We're going to have Maria go first this time. So what's something that you are unapologetic about in your ministry, in your life, or any of the above?
Yeah, I ain't sorry about saying that I really am at a place when I think about whatever the Christian tradition is, whatever it is to be in the future, I'm just not really interested anymore in conversations, particularly as a queer life, about whether I am or am not to be welcome in certain spaces. And I'm trying to figure out a way to say this that isn't just about me or about ego, but I think it's time for churches and Christian tradition to understand that actually it's not that I should or shouldn't be welcome. It's that I should be teaching. And here's what I mean by that. Like, it is the people with experiences. It is the people who've been wounded by the realities of white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity within the Christian tradition that I think have the bandwidth and the imagination to know how to heal and how to reform, and how, as Elisa put it, to how to let die and resurrect the heart of the tradition. And so I'm just not really up for wondering or musing anymore about whether or not queer people can or can't be or should or shouldn't be, or whether or not we do or don't need more diversity in our churches. Like, I want the posture to dramatically shift, right? For Christians to say, if we are to be anything meaningful, if we are to be moral, if we are to be shaped as moral witnesses in the world, it is time to now listen to and to be led by people who carry the wounds of the violence. That's where I am.
Sounds like a great thing to be unapologetic about. I fully affirm. Reverend Aldape?
So I think going along the lines of, we need diversity. I think it's taken a while to come to a place where the difference between we need your voice and we need you for the website or the brochure or the denominational information for the big conference that comes up, knowing the difference between those two things and knowing where I am truly needed and welcomed, and where all of me is truly needed and welcomed. and it's quite a tricky and hard thing to work through. And so, however, that is something that I'm learning to fully be unapologetic for, or not sorry for. In particular, like I mentioned earlier, this idea of body ownership kind of coming from colonial Christianity, and how that translates into the bodies of Black and brown women, and how our bodies have been policed, how our families were, or how our mothers and other women were taught that our bodies need to be policed, and kind of really leaning into fully accepting what all of my body brings to faith and to my calling and to my community, and knowing that just for that existence, that is resistance. And also meaning, what does that mean for the privilege that it carries, and how I get to move in the world in the way others don't, and trying to be trying to recognize that and fully confess of that, and when I have missed it. So I think that's the thing that I have been working through to be completely and fully unapologetic about. Yeah,
that's fair. It is always the journey, right? And so you're on the journey of being unapologetic about it. And I think it's a great journey to be on. I fully support and affirm that. And finally, light, I guess, Reverend Sarratt.
Yeah. So I sorry, totally builds off of Elisa's, I think. I'm not sorry that I'm done with like a theological separation of the body and the soul. I think that's a bunch of crap. And it also is where we construct a lot of things like white supremacy, or the way that we treat bodies, women's bodies, Black bodies, all kinds of, just the way that we abuse bodies. So we have this story, this theological narrative that as long as you save the soul, you can do whatever the heck you want to the body. And I think Kelly Brown Douglas does a beautiful job of really like telling us how far back that separation goes, but how that cracks the door open for all kinds of abuse. And you point to it earlier too, Lisa, about the abuse that comes from joining empire and power and colonialism and all of that to our theological narrative. And when we say, as long as we save your soul, it doesn't matter what we do to your body. Nah, that's not, I want no part in that religion. Like, somebody who I think is doing brilliant work on that front right now is Reesma Minikin. I don't know if you guys know this work. It's called My Grandmother's Hands. He's a Black trauma therapist, honestly, and he's doing all this historical work on how, like, our nervous systems, our bodies carry the weight of centuries of oppression and trauma and all that kind of stuff. And that until we're willing to pay attention and heal, like, the trauma in our bodies and our nervous systems, et cetera. I'm thinking Amy Cooper, for example, who is in theory progressive, liberal, et cetera, right? Who like calls the cops on the bird watcher in New York, right? Like, I mean, until you get to the root of where it resides within our beings, I don't think we're gonna like work it out of ourselves. And so I'm really compelled by how are we gonna actually remember and reconstruct like the whole of what it means to be human. So I'm sorry that I'm done with that theological story about how you can be, doesn't matter about your body as long as you're saved, right? Yeah. It's not enough.
Which is so odd, because remember, what council was it? It's the early church, one of the councils where they're trying to decide whether Gnosticism is like sound or not. And they decide that it's not sound because Gnostics were like all about body bad, soul good. And early Christians were like, no. It's a whole thing. Both. And yet here we are. Thousands of years later being like, just save the souls. We'll see you next year when we're back running your VBS.
No, I actually think that's a really great transition into a question I wanted to pose to y'all, just as three brilliant people who have spent a great deal of time in these topics. And we've seen a lot of concern about the Christian response to the president's COVID-19 diagnosis. I'm seeing a lot of pray for your enemies, a lot of turn the other cheek, a lot of things that feel like they could be in tension. And so I was wondering if y'all had given any thought to the dynamic of an oppressor falling ill or some other, we could maybe say natural, somewhat asked for, I don't know, consequences of actions. And as Christians, if that's something that is I guess there's, for lack of a better phrase, a response that feels authentic, particularly valuing Black, brown, and queer lives at the center.
It is some strategic gaslighting, some serious, and not, honestly, to be too blunt, like it's like an abuser physically harming a partner or spouse, right? And then crying, and then right, like because of the tears, we just keep telling her, stick it out. Like it's just so violent. I mean, I could say more, but like it's just so violent to demand, question that of lives being oppressed by this administration. It's violent.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's been the conversation we've been having the last several days. Is just like, and Maria alluded to it earlier, that we call them infantile or whatever else. But, a lot of people who work with children are like, yeah, but I know children that are a lot more kind and, all these other things. I think, honestly, like the language of abuser, it really does stick in a way. And I think that, particularly for those who are right in the reach and in the line of Trump's abuse, whose bodies literally are being harmed by his language and his policies and everything else, to tell those being abused that they have to show compassion in this moment. I think that's
and a certain
really
kind of compassion, right? Like,
a problematic call. Now, I don't have anything more to say about that. Like, enough people have tried to like sort of say we should pray for the president and all. I mean, do what you need to do, but like until we actually name the abuse for what it is, I think it's hard to ask that.
It's interesting, right, that a lot of the language being used. My concern is that it also reminds me of when particularly Black people are killed by police, and there's this push to forgive the police officer, right? They ask them over and over in interviews. They have the statements of forgiveness in the courtroom. They have like this big production, right, around forgiving this person who took the life of someone you love, and that it's immediate, right? It's not that you get a chance to mourn and go to therapy and grief counseling and come to this conclusion for yourself. This is something that needs to happen. A public forgiveness is important, and is honestly, when it's not given, there's almost a hostility on behalf of reporters and police, like, oh, how dare you not forgive? The Christian thing to do is forgive. When in reality, one, on its face, I think a lot of that is for production and is a cheap forgiveness, right? We know that actual forgiveness and reconciliation and rectifying of things takes time and energy and intention, that this isn't being given, right? So it's already cheap and shallow on its face.
Right.
But also there's a dismissal of a very real and authentic reaction that I think, when not taken seriously and when not weighed properly, has for lack of a better word, really bad results on the individual being forced to do so, or at least forced to profess so.
Yeah.
Elisa?
Yeah, no, I think everyone is absolutely right. And so about a month ago, my clergy coach and I have come to the conclusion that I don't really know what the word forgiveness means right now. And I am very thankful for liturgies and guided prayers, because when I don't believe them in those moments, there are other people who can believe them and pray them for me. And it has been, and I've talked to Lauren about this, it's been really fascinating to see how quick white faith leaders have been to say, do I pray for the president's death? No. Should we pray that it's happening? No, but you should pray for your enemy. And it immediately triggered any moment or any experience I've had where I have been bullied, I have been name called, I have been harassed by a man or other persons. And when I have stood up for myself, I have been forced to say I'm sorry. Their hurt feelings. And so last week and Thursday, all of the, just watching social media, people saying we need to pray for the president, it was much more triggering than I anticipated. And for me right now, where I am is I'm thankful other people can pray, because they can believe it for me. They can pray it for me. And yeah, that's where I am. And, as someone whose grandmother died alone and without any help and almost in a hallway because of COVID-19, because of how scary it was for people, it's really, and that's just that is just one story. It is hard to come to a place of forgiveness. That's where I'm at right now. Of when people in power demand a holy act from us.
And it is a holy act. And I think something I'm struggling with, right, is even, so one, the phrase love your enemies, pray for your enemies, being what it is, to me, if we want to take the word enemy, I feel like there's an inherent equality in that word, right? And so I don't even know if enemy can be the right word at times, because there's a power dynamic here that's not equal. And so I don't know that it's fair to say that call is even applicable, if I can be frank. And also I think that my first thought was but we know this president hasn't lifted a single prayer for the 210,000 lives that are the direct result of his incompetence, of his negligence, of his apathy. And so it's hard, for lack of a better word, to be a Christian in a space when that label means different things to different people. And the differences between those have actual lives on the line. That is a rough place to be.
But I mean, it's what happens when Christianity doesn't center the lives of those who, right? When we don't treat our religion as one shaped by people who were oppressed by imperial systems and resisted them with reimagining the social order, right? When we don't see it that way, then we don't position ourselves in relationship to say who's suffering most right now.
Yeah.
That's where we center ourselves. That's what our tradition tells us to do. So whatever's up with them, that's what we're talking about. Whatever's happening to them, that's what we're praying about. Whatever they're suffering through, that's what we're in solidarity with. Right? Until we recapture that moral language, we have nothing to give the world.
Yeah.
But transactional interpretations of things like forgiveness.
Right.
In them.
Right. A convenient Christianity of sorts.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case,
I said, or whatever.
Right, something like, but keeping that in mind, I want to go ahead and bring us to our final segment of Drunken Love, right? Wherein you're going to give us something that you've been consumed by recently, whether work or play, or something you'd wish you'd gotten a chance to say earlier. And then you're going to let us know the cocktail of your choice or drink of your choice in the moment. And I guess to mix it up, I can go first. Yeah. Something I've been completely consumed by lately has been rest in its own way. So something that's been interesting about this time frame has been a lot of conversation around rest and the desire that capitalism gives us to make everything productive, everything monetized. Like if you're not earning money behind it, then obviously it's a waste of time. And so giving myself permission to rest, permission to do nothing, permission to take care of myself has very much been a journey that I didn't realize I would struggle with in the way that I do. And so I think I've been consumed by taking time for myself, figuring out what I like, what I want to do with this gift of time that I've been given. This show, of course, being one of those, but it's been interesting that this time frame has given me a real reflection on what it means what self-care means on a host of different levels has been my latest thing that I'm consumed by. And what I'm having today is red wine because it matched my outfit, if I'm honest. So
that's
why I'm here. And so keeping that in mind, sending it over to Reverend Aldape.
Thank you. I think what I have just been consumed by in these days, I think in the last 2 years, I had brain surgery 2 years ago, and before that I was a pretty regular runner, and I was good at it, and it's taken 2 years to get to a place where I can run again without feeling dizzy or tired or like I'm about to pass out. And for a lot of it was about changing my body to what I thought was deemed acceptable. And so like I mentioned earlier, being fully accepting and loving myself and who I am and what I offer in spaces, in relationships. It's a really cool place to be in, and it changes relationships, some for not so great and some for the better. And so being fully accepting of my body and what it's capable of doing, and knowing its limits and knowing when to say, I'm going to stop. That's what I've really fully been consumed in that, and learning how to speak up when, there's just knowing to listening to my body, because that is something I don't think girls and people are trained to do, is listen to their body. And so it has been a really fun journey in doing that. So and today I am drinking a White Claw because it's what I had in my fridge.
Sounds like a great reason to drink it. Definitely. And sending it over to the Reverends of Calvary Baptist Church.
We're keeping up, having lived in South Carolina with Jamie Harrison's campaign. And anyway, our drink of choice is just a little bourbon on the rocks. But the difference is in paying homage to Jamie's brilliant hashtag, you cannot outdo Black people move, which was to put plexiglass wall between him and
that was so great.
So we poured ours in plastic cups today in homage to
Jamie Harrison,
his brilliant act there, because for me it was a really powerful symbol or image of what it means to protect the spirit and the body right now. And so we still got to show up to places that leave us in some pretty vulnerable and uncertain spaces, no doubt. But it doesn't mean we can't be thoughtful and smart about how we do it. and about how we protect ourselves in the process. And I just think that Jamie's act, I mean, I laughed for 20 minutes, but also like as I reflected, I was like, oh, that's so powerful. That's just such a powerful image of what it means to care for yourself while also like showing up.
Yeah.
So, plastic cups.
Amen.
Well, plexiglass. This is kind of like plexiglass.
Yeah. Even just the chance to get to elect somebody like Jamie Harrison, who's a brilliant candidate, right? Like that's, I mean, watching the debate, you're like, please God, this is what we want. Like this is what we want representation to look like, right? Like,
yeah.
I agree. It has been an absolute delight to have all of you here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy day. If someone wants to reach out to you to probe more about the brilliance that each of you has shared, what are some of the ways that they can contact you?
You can contact me on the Bird app known as the twitter.com. I think my handle, I know my handle is at AAALDAPE. It's just my last name because that was my email handle for college. And I figured just use it for everything. So yeah. And my tag name is Buharista Theology because, you know, it's spooky season.
It is.
You can find us on Twitter and Facebook, and then honestly, like connect with us, calvarydc.org. If you go to Calvary Baptist Church's Facebook page, we're on every Sunday morning. You get to hear what we're thinking about and up to there as we live stream worship via Zoom that just added a password or something. We got to get that figured out this week. Alisa, it's like every week, right? Something else.
It is something new every week.
Every week.
Thank y'all so much for being here. And I hope to have each of you back on soon in various capacities.
It's an honor to get to be with you.
Okay, so that wrapped this episode of Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. If you're looking for me, you can find me at Lauren Zayu on Twitter and Instagram, or you can follow us on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. I hope to see you soon. Thank you for tuning in to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered with host Lauren Zayu and music by Lighthouse Productions. For more information on Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, or to review today's episode, please follow at Lauren Zayu on Twitter and Instagram, or subscribe to the Lauren Zayu YouTube channel.